Hi, I'm filmmaker Aislinn Clarke, and I'm delighted via the Galway Film Fleadh to be talking today with Joe Dante. Joe has made many of our favourite films that lots of us remember really fondly. I know I do. Things like Gremlins, The Burbs, The Howling, and I'm delighted to chat to him today. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing just fine, thanks. I wish I was in Ireland.
Well, yeah, I could be anywhere at the minute, kind of in this lockdown and not really going outside very much, but yeah, it's always nice to be here. Thank you so much for talking to me today. It's a real delight. I've long been a fan since childhood of your films. I know many people that I know feel the same. I watched the Gremlins every single Christmas and did so with my son also when he was small. Uh, I watched The Burbs probably once a year at least. I'm a big fan. And also The Howling. I actually watched it about 2 weeks before I got the message asking me to do this talk. I'd actually watched The Howling again. So there you are. Um, I wanted to talk to you first about how you started out in film. And I know that you worked for Roger Corman, who, of course, himself is a big iconic movie monster person. And you started out, if I'm not wrong, by cutting trailers. Is that right?
I did. I wanted to be a cartoonist when I was a kid, and to get into art school, I had to take painting and things like that. I really wasn't very good at it, and they said cartooning isn't an art anyway. And I wanted to stay in art school because my math grades were so terrible that I wouldn't have gotten it anywhere else. And so I took a film course because it's the closest thing to comic books and the storyboards and the whole thing. I mean, everybody knows that comic books are the gateway to movies. And I had always liked trailers because they were punchy and fun and had lots of hyperbole and sayings written all over them. And so I did a couple of trailers for pictures that for a company that Roger was running at the time. It was strictly non-union, which meant that it would hire kids just out of film school or right off the street. And the pictures were successful, and I ended up as part of the trailer department of his company, which they never had one before. They would bring people in off the street and try to teach them how to do the style that he liked. And then they figured, well, why not just get some kid and put him there and, we'll have him do the trailers. And then there were some others who joined, and we finally had done so many trailers for not very good movies. And in analyzing a trailer, you have to look at the movie and you have to figure out, okay, how do I cut this thing down to 3 minutes or 2 minutes and still get the essence across? And you learn a lot. You learn about, what's needed in a shot to cover it and what's needed to make somebody go from point A to point B and whether or not you really needed to reverse or not. And we started to, pick up all this information, and we said, well, maybe we can do a movie as good as these pictures, because some of these pictures aren't very good. A lot of them were from the Philippines. And so Roger said, okay, you got to keep making trailers, but it's got to be the cheapest movie that we've ever made here. And you got 10 days to do it and $60,000. And we figured the only way that we were going to ever make a movie that was releasable with action scenes is to use the scenes from the trailers that we had been cutting and make them the action highlights of the movie and have it be a movie about a movie company. At the time, Roger was doing a series of 3 girls movies with teachers and nurses, and the girls would take off their clothes and get in trouble. But there would always be some action scenes. And so we started to write our script around these scenes from other pictures and dress our actresses as the people in the clips. And we made this pretty silly movie called Hollywood Boulevard, which is, in fact, a very accurate representation of what it was like making low-budget movies in the 1970s.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And you're very right, I think, about trailers. It's kind of like, as a writer, if you're writing a script and then you try to do the log line and you find that you're really struggling, it's just a couple of sentences. But that's when you know there's something essential missing. And I think the trailer in the same way. They get to the essential heart. What is this? What makes it tick? And that's a really useful way of kind of getting into what is this movie? What makes it work, Speaking of Roger Corman, and he was famous for kind of torn from the headlines, isn't that what they said? He would take things that were big, salacious stories and turn them into movies. And I was wondering about that and in terms of The Howling. So the iconic moment in The Howling, for me anyway, I think, is when the heroine, who's the newscaster at the end of it, live on air, she ends it all. She takes a gun and ends her own life because she doesn't want to turn into this monster and she wants people to know what's really happening out there. And that's obviously a reference to Christine Chubbuck, who had done this in real life a number of years earlier. Do you think? Is that coming?
I'm not sure that entered into it. Roger's ability to make a movie based on the headlines was pretty remarkable. He made it in 1958. He made a movie called War of the Satellites, which managed to hit theaters like a month and a half after Sputnik came out, and everybody was marveling at how did he get this thing done so fast? And I guess he had some divination of what might be happening up in space, and sure enough, he was able to capitalize on it. And he managed to do that with the biker movies, and he managed to do that with The Trip, which is about LSD. He's really made quite a career out of not just his own movies, but movies from the kids like me, who he, I wouldn't say dragged out of the gutter, but it certainly brought into a movie business that would not have been very welcoming otherwise.
Yeah, and of course he started off the careers of lots of directors that are really big now that we all know and love really well. So I was thinking then about, first of all, you talk about Roger Corman and his headlines, and I'm thinking about the trailers again, and how the headline is kind of like a trailer for this article. It's the essential story condensed into this small piece of space, and how you can use that to kind of jettison off into something else. But moving on from that, Spielberg comes in after this. So you directed Piranha, and that was being released in the same year as Jaws 2, which could have been seen as kind of like coming up head to head against Spielberg's Jaws. But then, of course, he went on to have a working relationship with Spielberg. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, it turned out that Universal was not happy that this ripoff movie Piranha was coming out the same year as Jaws 2, and they were going to get an injunction, apparently, to try to stop the release of the movie, as they had done with several other shark movies that were made overseas. But in this case, Spielberg saw the movie, and he realized that it was a spoof, and so he told them to knock it off. So in a way, if it wasn't for him, I wouldn't have had a career, because if they hadn't released the movie, I never would have gotten a second job.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think, like, yes, it's a spoof, but it's a very warm-hearted spoof. It's effective. It's not,
of course, I love these pictures. I mean, I love the genre, and there's a lot of political stuff in Piranha, which was John Sayles certainly added, and we've sort of done that in our careers, as to try to stick some subversive messages inside the package that people are paying money to see, and it's worked out very well for both of us as Corman alumni. Yeah.
How important do you think that is? Do you think that's a kind of a responsibility, or is it just a personal preference to engage politically with your films?
Well, I don't know that a lot of people consciously do that. For my feeling is that if the movie isn't personal to me, then I have difficulty. So I try not to ever make a movie that I wouldn't go see if someone else had made it. And so the effort to keep your personality alive in the movie you're working, it can be very difficult, depending on what the budget is and how many producers there are and what the expectations are and all that nonsense. But if you can manage to look back on your career and say, well, this looks like a movie that I made, as opposed to this was an assignment that I did that's indistinguishable from 5 other movies on the same topic. The trick for me has always been to try to make that difference, to give the movies a personality where people can identify you from movie to movie.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's funny, actually, because nowadays the horror film scene is very political. Everybody wants to make horror films that have some kind of social commentary, since we had things like Get Out and stuff that is a scary movie, but it's about something. That's become the norm and expectation now, certainly in the conversations that I have.
That's true. But Get Out is more in the tradition of the Twilight Zone. The TV show where it was a fantasy show, it was a science fiction show, but all the episodes were about something. And I think with Get Out, they're obviously it's a message movie. It's a horror film first, but then it's also secondly a message movie.
Yeah, exactly. So getting back to Steven Spielberg, and Gremlins. And I think one of the things that makes Gremlins so iconic and so well loved and remembered is the creature design, and in particular Gizmo and how adorable he is. And first of all, we've got a wee clip that we want to play that illustrates that.
What? Mogwai. I don't know, some Chinese word. I just call him Gizmo. He seems to like it.
Okay. Gizmo, look up here a minute.
Hey, get our picture taken. Smile.
Ready? 1, 2, 3.
No.
What happened?
He hates bright lights. You know, there's some things I forgot to tell you guys, and they're really important. Number one, he hates bright lights. We know that. But you got to keep him out of the sunlight. Sunlight will kill him. Number two, keep him away from water. Don't give him any water to drink. And whatever you do, don't give him a bath. And probably the most important thing, don't ever feed him after midnight.
So that's Gizmo. That's how we meet Gizmo in Gremlins, and of course became cemented in children's hearts all over the world. I know that I absolutely loved that film at the time, and I still do. As I say, every Christmas.
You know, I think one of the reasons that you're putting your finger on it, that the picture has remained popular, is because of Gizmo. And interestingly, the credit for that goes to Steven Spielberg. It's not that he designed Gizmo. In fact, he was very picky about what the design was, and he turned down many designs to our horror because we were trying to get things ready to shoot. And oh, that's no good. Finally, we made him the same color as Steven's dog, and then he went for it. But in the original script, Gizmo turns into Stripe the Bad Gremlin after about a half an hour. And we were proceeding, and it was initially more of a horror film. And we were proceeding under those concepts. But when Steven got a look at Gizmo, he said, no, this is a mistake. He shouldn't turn into the bad gremlin. He should stick around and be the hero's pal for the whole movie, which I think is the key to why the picture has been so beloved over the years. However, in our case, it just struck terror into our hearts because we were totally unprepared to have this little bucket of bolts that we had created that was good enough to last for 20 minutes now had to be like the star of the movie. And so we had to go back to the drawing board. We had to do a giant Gizmo, which was terrifying to see, a huge Gizmo head for the close-ups because the little one was so small that you just couldn't get the kind of subtlety out of it. And there were just numerous problems with trying to make this technology work because nobody had ever done a puppet show in this level before. But as it turned out, I think that I like the movie. I think it's funny and it's dark and all those things. But the key, I think, that has made it such a popular movie over the last 30 years or so, more I guess, is Gizmo.
Yeah.
Who, of course, they merchandised immediately. But the studio didn't really quite understand the movie. They were doing it as a favor to Steven. It was not a big, expensive movie. And they said, well, it's his first picture for his new company, and so let's let him do what he wants, but as long as he doesn't spend too much money. So then when they saw the dailies of Gizmo showing up the first time, coming out of the box, you could just hear the cash registers ringing in their eyes. It was like, holy crap, we can merchandise this thing. And so they piled on a lot of people to work on the merchandising over a very short period and managed to put out a number of toys and dolls and things like that. And they really did merchandise the heck out of it. And again, it was a complete surprise to them because they really didn't quite understand the movie. But when they went to the preview and the audience loved it, it was like, oh, okay, it must be good.
Yeah, well, he's completely adorable and we really feel for him. And we know that he wants, most of all, he's very human because we know that he wants to be good, that he doesn't want to give over to his dark side. And that's what so many people deal with day in, day out, trying to be a good person. It's quite a complex journey for that little Gizmo. But I know I didn't know anybody who didn't want to open a box at Christmas that year and find a little Gizmo inside it. So yeah, I think that's beautiful work. And had you worked with creatures before? Was this your first creature design journey?
Well, no, I did. You know, we had to build the piranhas because it was very hard to train real
Or,
ones, and so those were puppets. And then on the Howling, of course, we had to design the werewolf. We
yeah,
only had one werewolf, which we had to, with cutting, make it look like it was a lot of werewolves. I was a big Ray Harryhausen fan, so I was a monster kid, as we were called at the time. There's a whole bunch of kids who were brought up in Famous Monsters magazine who all thought that they were kind of just lonely nerds in their schools, and then they discovered in this magazine that there were other kids out there like them, and it formed a sort of a brotherhood. And so by the time I got to doing Gremlins, I was pretty much of a monster
yeah,
aficionado.
yeah. I think the special thing about Gizmo is as well is that he, whereas the Howling, you've got monsters that are nasty monsters, and in Piranha, they're obviously evil fish. But Gizmo makes us we're not afraid of him. He makes us feel for him. And it's little details like the trembling, when he jumps into the arms of the dad and his little trembling body, and all of that just really makes us feel for this little creature.
Oh,
And
it's at heart, it's really a boy and his dog movie. I mean, there already is a dog in the movie, but Gizmo is sort of like his puppy, and also Gizmo has a very infantile quality that people find very appealing, and
yeah,
and they want to take care of him. So, and in many scenes in the movie, he's actually treated like he's a baby.
yeah. And he's got the big eyes and all that. Can't help but love. So talking about your childhood and growing up, and I know you were big into the B movies, going to see the monster movies and the theater on the weekends and that kind of thing. What do you think it is that, because I was the same, we didn't have, I didn't live anywhere near a cinema, but my dad used to rent old horror movies, Hammer Horrors, the old monster movies from the 50s every weekend, and we would sit and watch them together. And that was really formative for me and really what got me into this stuff in the first place. But what do you think it is that is so attractive about that? What is it that some children in particular just really cling to, and then for their whole lives they're big horror fans? What's the appeal?
You got to remember, most kids' first experience at the movies is usually somebody, an uncle or their parents take them to a Disney picture. And Snow White is got a lot of terrifying stuff in it, and Pinocchio has one of the great transformations of all time, where the kids turn into donkeys. I mean, Walt knew that the part of the appeal of fairy tales was the fear part and the fact that they're scary. And usually there's a happy ending, although if you get into the real fairy tales, very often they don't have happy endings. But there's a fairy tale quality to it. It is very appealing, and also, the idea of being scared. It's the same reason why people go on roller coasters. I mean, it's to be safely scared and to go to the movies and get all of that stuff out, and then be able to go outside into the sunlight, into your real life again, is salutary, and people really do like that. But it's interesting. It's mostly young people who really like horror. They get into horror films when they're young, and I think it's partly because part of the appeal about horror films is dealing with death. And when you're a kid, death is just an abstract. It's something that supposedly you're supposed to do someday, but you're never gonna, because you're a kid. You're gonna live forever. And so they go to the Final Destination movies, and they think it's hilarious when people get run over by buses and things, because it's something that's out of their wheelhouse of imagining. The thing that's always amazed me is of all the genres, the war picture, the Western, and all those things that used to be so popular and so important. There used to be so many Westerns on TV in the 50s, you wouldn't believe it. But the lowly horror film, the one genre that never got any real love or any real critical approbation, is the one that has survived over all these generations. The horror films are just as popular now, or maybe more so, than they were in the early 30s during the Depression.
Yeah, there is something.
Right now.
There is something, I think, really primal about, and as you say, with fairy tales and so on, humans have a long, long history of dark stories, and we learn from them. There's something cathartic. You get to dip your toe a little bit into really negative, bad things, but in a safe way, and then feel that feeling, but not actually be at any risk. I think this is part of it. And for my part, I was quite an anxious child. I was like constantly worrying about stuff that a child should, weird stuff like bombs and everything. But then I grew up in a civil war in Northern Ireland as well. So I suppose it was rational for me to be quite anxious and on edge. And I've always felt that that fed into why I loved horror so much, why I gravitated towards it. I was far too young to see these things. So I was maybe 7 when I saw A Nightmare on Elm Street for the first time. My mother totally freaked out, but I was completely intoxicated, and I rewound it and watched it again, and was just something was there was a release in this, there was something in it that stuck with me, and that's why I'm still such a fan of these things today. And yes, I think you get into this a bit in Matinee, which is my favorite of your films. I really love Matinee. I think it doesn't get as much love as it should, or it isn't as well known as some of the other films. But I have a clip that we'll play now that illustrates the point I'm making here.
I didn't think anybody recognized Herb. What, do you spend your whole life sitting in monster movies?
A lot, yeah. Somebody like Herb or Vincent Price. Or someone. It's like they're my friends.
That's a strange group. What are your real friends like?
I don't have too many. My dad's in the Navy, so we move all the time.
Oh, man. 500 new kids a year? That's scary. I remember the one time we moved. Now, this was to the big town, Hatfield, Missouri. I was petrified of those guys.
Really?
Oh, yeah. But see, now I get my revenge. I get to scare everybody else, but it's for their own good. See, people who go like this at the scary parts, they're not getting the whole benefit. You got to keep your eyes open.
What's the benefit?
Okay, like a zillion years ago, a guy's living in the cave. He goes out one day, bam, he gets chased by a mammoth. Now, he's scared to death, but he gets away. And when it's all over with, he feels great.
Well, yeah, because he's still living.
Yeah, but he knows he is, and he feels it. So he goes home, back to the cave. First thing he does a drawing of the mammoth. And he thinks, people are coming to see this. Let's make it good. Let's make the teeth real long and the eyes real mean. Boom. The first monster movie. That's probably why I still do it. Make the teeth as big as you want, then you kill it off. Everything's okay. The lights come up.
So that's what I was talking about, basically. I think that's the essential magic of horror and why we return to it again, again, and again. And as the John Goodman character says in Matinee, earlier in the movie, the Cuban Missile Crisis has just started, basically, and there's a suggestion that they shouldn't run the movie because there's all this scary stuff going on in the real world and people probably want light relief. But he says, no, this is what they want at this kind of time. And my understanding is that this was true also after the Second World War. There was a feeling that people would want light entertainment when actually they gravitated towards quite heavy, dark material because there's something. Yeah, yes, exactly. And or even a noir like Brief Encounter, which is really about a relationship and an affair. They gravitated towards the murkier side of life or the darker things. They wanted to get into negative emotions at that time, which a lot of people were surprised by. But for me, the whole of Matinee, that's my understanding of Matinee. It's probably one of the reasons why I like it so much, because I grew up in Crisis too, and it's
I was the age of the lead kid when that happened, and so it was very personal for me. I had a little brother who was approximately the same age as the kid in the movie, and we all thought that it was the last weekend. We thought that there was going to be no school on Monday or ever, and it was probably as close as I could get to the way you felt living in Northern Ireland during the Trouble. The idea that you just couldn't count on anything, that the world could end, and you had nothing to say about it. That was just the way these people were the way the adults were running the world, and it was a very scary time, and it's very. If it weren't for the movie, which I think does exemplifies it a little bit. It's just very hard to get people to understand how believable it was that this was it, that this was all over.
Yeah, yeah, I get that completely. And I think there's a moment in Matinee that is actually really quite scary, even though it's mostly a comedy, this movie. But when it's very poignant when the kid wakes up in the middle of the night and he thinks his dad has come home. And he goes out into the living room. He thought he heard his dad speaking to his mum, and he's not there. But he goes and opens the front door, and then we see the atom bomb, the mushroom cloud in the distance, and there's just that feeling of that this could happen at any moment, that this is just hanging over your head, the end of the world right here and now, that I really find quite affecting in an otherwise quite lighthearted film.
We used to walk to school, and kids would say, well, what would you do right now if the bomb dropped? And, and it was like, oh, I'd go kiss Susie McGillicuddy, or whatever. But it was a constant. It was just a belief that hung over us and my entire generation. And I'm sure it a lot of difference in some of the choices that they made.
Yeah, it's a very traumatic thing to actually grow up through, and to still find space to be so light, because your films most of them are treading this line between horror and comedy. And I just wanted to talk to you a bit about how you feel those two things go together. For me personally, and the films that I make are very much horror films. I enjoy comedy as well, but it's just not the kind of stuff I write. But there's something in common. They're both about timing. They're about knowing when to deliver the blow. And certainly in terms of horror, I think the horror is actually, whereas in comedy the joke is the satisfaction. In horror, the moment of the shock, of the fright, is a release in a different way. We get to go, okay, it's over now. The horror is in the space before that. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on that, like horror, comedy.
Well, I've always found them to be very closely associated, partly because of the absurdity of the plots of most horror films, and the fact that you have to be careful not to get laughs in the wrong place, which is probably one of the reasons why, even starting with Piranha, I was trying to make sure that the absurdity of the premise was not going to overcome the audience's belief in what was going on. So there would always be something to offset the scariness or offset the melodrama of it. And it also made it entertaining. But, I grew up on the films of James Whale. And of course, in movies like The Invisible Man, he's crazy. He's insane. He's a homicidal maniac. And yet he does things that are so unexpected that it makes you laugh. But after you laugh, he throws a pot of ink at some cop in one scene, and then that seems sort of funny, and then he beats him to death with a chair, which is less funny. And in pictures like Bride of Frankenstein, that really do play off the idea that the macabre has a humorous side to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think laughing and screaming are very closely related. And in fact, I was reading about this fairly recently, that anthropologists, I don't know if you've ever heard this, that they understand how laughing evolved was when prehistoric people would be out. Let's say you've got a bunch of prehistoric guys and they're out doing a bit of hunting, and then there's something rustling in the bushes over there. That could be a saber-toothed tiger. That could be something really scary. One of them will go over and investigate what's in the bushes over there, and everybody's holding their breath like this. It could be something that's going to kill us all. But then he sees that it's just like a little kitty cat, it's just something small and cute. It's a raccoon or something. And he laughs because the release of the fear is amusing. And that's how laughter evolved, because he's communicating to them, it's okay. And then it's a social thing. They all laugh together because they're saying, oh, it's okay. Look, we were so silly, but we're okay. We're safe now.
Oh, that's the laughter of relief, and that's what you get very often in a horror film. That if you scare them, then they'll scream, and then they'll laugh at themselves.
Exactly.
And the trick is to try to orchestrate that in a way that works for the story and keeps it going.
Absolutely. There's a difference in people laughing at a horror film where it's not meant to be funny, and they're laughing at how ridiculous it is, or laughing as a relief when they've got
Or
scared.
laughing at themselves for getting fooled, you know.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Um, one of the things that strikes me about your films is in most of your films, I feel like there's a great feeling of warmth for families, and even if they're not standard normal nuclear families, there's just a real sense of warmth in that family unit in the home, in films like The Hole and Gremlins and Matinee as well. People who are related to each other in one house, a family pulling together and getting through this thing or facing something to get past that. The Burbs as well, of course. And I think that's interesting. Is that something that you feel is a mark of your work?
I've never actually thought about it in that way, but I think that comes from my feeling about, I mean, we all come from families. We all have, relationships, and the one place that you tend to want to retreat when things are at their most fraught is back to the family. It's your basis for how you think. It's how you've been brought up. That's part of who you are.
Yeah, it does feel like that in your films, that is the wholesome place that you can return to. That's where it feels safe. Thinking about the Burbs, and so we have these people who are living in the suburbs, and my feeling about this is that, and you might disagree with me totally, but sometimes people talk about it as a fear of outsiders kind of movie, where my feeling is that these guys actually want the outsiders. I feel that they're excited. They're getting to live the boys' adventure. It's going to give them some excitement in their lives, whereas being in the suburbs feels like it might be slightly calcifying, and this is a way for them to feel like vibrant again. And we have a clip.
That's true. They need it. They need this disruption in their lives, which are otherwise very boring.
Yes, that is the major thing I get from it. We have a clip that'll illustrate that now.
Do you know what this is? It's a bone. It's a femur. It's a femur bone. A femur just happens to be a human thigh bone, right?
Wait, how do you know that?
Biology 101. I mean, look at the size of this thing. You think this came off a chicken or something? Where the hell did Vince get this?
He dug it up from underneath the fence.
Ray, there's no doubt anymore. This is real. Your neighbors are murdering people. They're chopping them up. They're burying them in their backyard.
And for me, it's just, there's a real sense of, even though they're using these words like your neighbors chopping people up, burying them in the backyard, that they're secretly really quite happy that this adventure is happening to them now, that they get to take part in a boy's adventure story that they would have read when they were kids.
And you notice that the wives are a lot less enamored of this pursuit.
I did know that. And because someone said to me when I said I was going to be talking to you, I've always wondered about the Burbs, because it starts out as this kind of fear of outsiders, kind of satire, for want of a better word. But then at the end, their fears are proven to be, they were right. The outsiders should have been feared. But for me, it wasn't really about that. I mean, you can, I think you understand what I'm saying, that actually I think they needed it to be true. They needed it to be true for them to feel properly alive again. They were sitting there in their deck chairs in the backyard drinking beers and, watching football on the TV, and they just needed something to make them feel like they were not calcified suburban past it men.
I think that's true. And I think that in the end, when the dust clears, it's like they've been to war. It's like they have their own mythos now. They've risen to the occasion.
Interestingly, one of the neighbors as well is a veteran, isn't he?
Yeah.
And he too just gets as childish as they do. They literally do ding dong ditch, they run over, press the doorbell, run away again, and they just turn into kids again. And really, that's what it's about for them. That it makes them feel alive again.
It's funny that it's such a popular movie, and it kind of came and went when it was new, but over the years it's gained such a cult following. I mean, there's a trivia book about it, and there's a website where people, write in. They look at the movie and they write in their insights and all that stuff. It's really quite remarkable what a long life it's had.
Yeah, I think it's a really great movie, and I don't know anybody who doesn't love The Burbs. As I say, I watch it probably once a year, but just kind of spinning off from that idea about these men who get to be boys again and who get to feel full of life and everything. I think there's perhaps something going on in your movies where around masculinity, around the idea of the ideal male or the hero, and all of your heroes either aren't quite there yet, they're too young, or else it's like they're just slightly past it and they're trying to recapture it again. And it's like a feeling that moment never actually happens, that moment of being the hero, being the man on the cover of the Boys Adventure mag. What do you think about that?
Well, I think it's probably best illustrated in Inner Space, where your lead character is kind of nerdy, and the guy he's got inside him is, as you said, a guy who's a little bit past his prime and is trying to prove himself again. And when I was first handed that script, it was not a comedy. It was a serious, if you can believe it, spy movie with that plot.
Wow.
And I suggested that maybe that wasn't something that I thought I could make work, and I went away. And when they came back, they had hired a new writer whose gimmick was, he said, well, what would happen if Dean Martin was shrunk down and injected into Jerry Lewis? And that I could understand, because when I was a kid, Dean and Jerry were very, very popular. And so there's a lot of masculinity discussions in that picture, and it's a movie that was really a lot of fun to make, and again, it's another picture it's gained a lot more popularity over the years.
Yes, I haven't seen that in a while, but that was definitely a big favorite in our house when we were young. We watched that over and over and over again. We loved that movie. It's so good. But I think that is where it's most prominent, this idea of masculinity and what that means. And for me, it's one of the most charming things about your films is that these heroes that we really like and that we feel very warm to, and none of them have to perform this hyper masculinity in order for us to like them. And in fact, they're grappling with it. Most of them seem to be grappling with it in some way. In Matinee as well, the kid Omri Katz is dating this girl, and she's got this big scary ex-boyfriend, and who does represent that kind of tough guy, I guess, but in a way that doesn't really work out for him or for anybody else,
Oh, but he's sensitive. He's a poet.
Yes, he's a poet. I forgot about that element. He is actually, he's a poet. He's quite, So I like how you complicate masculinity in that way and think about it a bit sideways. I think that's very appealing. So,
here. I when it comes to masculinity, I have no peers. Put it that way.
I think that's a great way to look at things. Well, thank you so much for chatting to me today, Joe. It's been so nice to learn a little bit more about your films and how they were made. And as I say, I've been a fan my whole life, and it's really been a great joy. And
it's my pleasure.
Thank you to the Galway Film Fleadh as well for putting this all together, and thank you to everybody at home who tuned in to watch this today.